One of the most popular and well-known commanders of the Second World War, General George Smith Patton Jr. ruthlessly drove his troops to victory in North Africa, Sicily, France and Germany, playing a key role during the Battle of the Bulge. Yet, in Sicily 1943, Patton got into a bit of trouble and ended up getting relieved of command. Famously, he slapped 2 soldiers, and this is usually seen as the reason why. However, as one of my patrons says, during the Sicily Campaign, there were 2 instances of war crimes committed by American forces. The Biscari Massacre. The American forces involved were under General Patton's command, but the cases were suppressed. How much do you think these cases contributed to Patton being relieved of command, as opposed to the heavily publicised incidents that are focused on in the history's biographies? And as an aside, would you ever consider discussing the potential war crimes committed by non-Soviet Allied forces during World War II, and how they were handled at the time, and how history has handled them? I have no problem discussing Allied crimes. The only reason I haven't really touched upon them is because there haven't been any in the battles and campaigns I've covered so far. In future, when I do come across such incidents, I will talk about them. Also, YouTube doesn't like this sort of topic, so I'm going to have to be very careful in the way that I present the information to you. Otherwise, they'll slap me down. So, was the Biscari incident the actual reason Patton was relieved of command? And was the slappening just the straw that broke the camel's back? Well, let's see what happened first, then we'll discuss. By 1943, the Allies had finally cleared the Axis from North Africa and decided to land in Sicily. Operation Husky started on the 10th of July 1943, although Patton's 7th Army, containing Bradley's 2nd Corps, didn't start their landings until the 11th. After 3 days of non-stop combat, Cookson's 180th Infantry Regiment of Middleton's 45th Infantry Division captured the airfield at Biscari. Here, there were 2 incidents where American soldiers killed German and Italian prisoners of war. The first occurred when Major Denman, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 18th Regiment, ordered Sergeant Horace West to take the 48 prisoners, mostly Italian but with 2 or 3 Germans, to the rear, off the road, where they would not be conspicuous, and hold them for questioning. West and some other soldiers did as instructed, and when they reached their destination, West halted the group and ordered some of the prisoners to be sent for interrogation. Once they were separated from the main group, West lined the remaining 36 prisoners up, borrowed a Thompson submachine gun from the company's first sergeant, telling him that he was going to kill them. He then said to the other American soldiers, "Turn around if you don't want to see it," and proceeded to shoot the prisoners, with the group of prisoners who were to be interrogated witnessing the incident. He then reloaded and shot any survivors, although 2 of the prisoners managed to escape. One, Giuseppe Grianola, was hit in the arm and then faked death, lying under the corpses for 2 hours. West, though, ordered the prisoners, who were chosen to be interrogated, marched off to the division's intelligence unit, leaving the bodies beside the road. Grianola then crawled away, although was shot in the neck by another American soldier. More merciful US soldiers picked him up shortly thereafter and took him to a US field hospital. The division's chaplain later found the bodies and reported the incident, although General Bradley, 2nd Corps commander, had already heard about the rumour of the execution by the time he got the report. The second incident happened 3 or so hours later when a Captain Compton, commander of A Company of the 180th Infantry Regiment, received word that another 36 Italian soldiers had surrendered. Because they had just been sniped at from the same area, Compton immediately ordered a sergeant from his company to form a firing squad with automatic weapons and execute the prisoners. Compton personally lined up the prisoners in single file and gave the firing order himself, although some of the men actually volunteered to be in the firing squad because they believed they were following a lawful order. When he heard about this incident too, General Bradley personally spoke to Compton. Compton told Bradley that, because the enemy he had faced had sniped at them, I didn't consider them as prisoners. General Bradley was horrified by what had happened, drove to Patton's headquarters and reported the incidents. Patton then replied that it was probably an exaggeration and told Bradley, Tell the officer responsible for the shootings to certify that the dead men were snipers or had attempted to escape or something, as it would make a stink in the press, so nothing can be done about it. Bradley, though, disagreed. He decided to try the men for murder and persuaded Patton that this was serious. At this point, Patton agreed that a trial should occur. 2 war correspondents who had seen the bodies also appeared at Patton's headquarters to protest these and other prisoner killings. Patton pledged to halt the atrocities, and the reporters apparently never printed a word. Middleton, the 45th Infantry Division's commander, court-martialed West and Compton. Sergeant West's defence counsel reported at his court-martial that he had been fatigued at the time of the incident due to the heavy combat experience, and that he had basically lost his sanity when the killings occurred. But the main defence he put forth was that General Patton had announced prior to the invasion of Sicily that prisoners should only be taken under limited circumstances. The 180th Infantry Regiment's commander, Colonel Cookson, testified that Patton had wanted the division to be a division of killers, and that if the enemy didn't surrender by the time that US troops had got within 200 yards of them, then surrender wasn't to be accepted. The problem with this defence was that West had murdered the prisoners after they had already surrendered, so they were already prisoners. Their surrender had already been accepted. So even if Patton did say this, which Cookson testified that he had repeated Patton's orders verbatim to the troops, then Patton's orders to kill prisoners before they surrendered wouldn't apply to prisoners who were already in the rear and had long surrendered. So this defence didn't work. And the fact that West had borrowed a Thompson from his first sergeant and an extra clip of 30 rounds, then had killed the prisoners, shows that he hadn't done it as a reaction, but had actually premeditated the murder. Thus, he wasn't insane either. In fact, a team of psychiatrists examined him and declared him sane, and he was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Compton's court-martial was a bit different because he had ordered his men to kill the prisoners. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself. However, the US Field Manual said that a soldier being ordered to commit a crime had a valid defence. Offences by armed forces. The principal offences of this class are making use of poisoned and otherwise forbidden arms and ammunition, killing of the wounded, ill-treatment of prisoners of war. Individuals of the armed forces will not be punished for these offences in case they are committed under orders or sanction of their government or commanders. The commanders ordering the commission of such acts, or under whose authority they are committed by the troops, may be punished by the belligerent into whose hands they may fall. Only the commanders ordering the crimes would be punished, so Compton would still be punished for giving the order. But it gets more complicated than that, because Compton said that he was also acting under the orders of General Patton. In his official statement, Compton said, "During the Camberwell operation in North Africa, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, in a speech to assembled officers, stated that in the case where the enemy was shooting to kill our troops, and then that we came close enough on him to get him, decided to quit fighting, he must die. Those men had been shooting at us to kill, and had not marched up to us to surrender. They had been surprised and routed, putting them, in my belief, in the category of the General's statement." Compton then said he remembered word for word what Patton had told the officers of the 45th Infantry Division in North Africa. According to Compton, these are the instructions that Patton gave. "When we land against the enemy, don't forget to hit him and hit him hard. We will bring the fight home to him. We will show him no mercy. He has killed thousands of your comrades and he must die. If you company commanders, in leading your men against the enemy, find him shooting at you, and when you get within 200 yards of him and he wishes to surrender, oh no, that B will die. You will kill him, stick him between the 3rd and 4th ribs. You will tell your men that. They must have the killer instinct. Tell them to stick him. He can do no good then. Stick him in the liver. We will get the name of killers, and killers are immortal." When word reaches him that he is being faced by a killer battalion, a killer outfit, he will fight less. Particularly, we must build up that name as killers, and you will get that down to your troops in time for the invasion. Another soldier in Compton's company and another officer confirmed that similar words had been spoken and passed down to the troops, so effectively Compton claimed that he had just been following orders. I ordered them shot because I thought it came under the general's instructions. Right or wrong, a 3-star general's advice, who has had combat experience, is good enough for me, and I took him at his word. He also claimed that some of the snipers were dressed in civilian clothes and so deserved to be shot. In the end, Captain Compton was found not guilty of murder. Obviously, it was ridiculous that an officer had got away with a crime while a sergeant had got life imprisonment, and this was recognised at the time. You know, if anything, it should have been the other way around, or both, or General Patton should have taken responsibility for having ordered the men to not take prisoners. Yes, technically, Patton didn't order his men to kill prisoners that had already been taken, but it's easy to see why the men under his command interpreted no prisoners to mean if you take prisoners, kill them. The soldier who testified at the Compton trial reported that he had been told that Patton's words were, "F them, no prisoners." The other officer reported Patton telling them, "The more prisoners we took, the more we'd have to feed, and not to fool with prisoners." There's a clear message of no prisoners here. Now, to be fair, Patton was correct to tell the men to be careful taking prisoners because surrendering Axis soldiers sometimes threw grenades or shot at the men they were surrendering to, and it seems that both the US and Canadian reports at the time confirmed that German soldiers often faked surrender in order to get the upper hand over the Allied troops. Patton wrote to his wife on the 3rd of August telling her that the Italians and Germans have now pulled the white flag trick 4 times. We take few prisoners. And, indeed, German atrocities in Sicily were so rampant during the first few days of the campaign that both sides soon abandoned taking prisoners. Truscott's 3rd Division also had numerous unpleasant experiences, particularly with the Italians. So Patton was perhaps right to warn the men about this, but Patton, of course, was wrong to say don't take any prisoners at all if they surrender within a short distance of the American front line. Yes, there may have been some fake surrenders, but that's no reason to urge your soldiers to not take prisoners and thus shoot anyone with their hands in the air. That's clearly the wrong behaviour, and Patton was wrong no matter which way you interpret his orders. And it's understandable why his men did interpret his instructions as kill everything that has surrendered. Both West and Compton plus others stated that Patton said these things and that they had interpreted his orders as such, so maybe others had as well. Presumably, the reason West was found guilty and Compton wasn't was due to the fact that while West had brought up Patton's order, he didn't really use it as part of his defence, instead relying on the sanity plea. But either way, these incidents made the US Army and US War Department worry about the backlash of public opinion and of enemy reprisals, so they decided to suppress what happened. The media wasn't informed and the files were locked away. Patton was then investigated about the Biscari incidents, and he told the investigator that he had been misinterpreted and that they could only have been interpreted as an order to kill prisoners by the wildest stretch of the imagination. While it's true that his orders may have been misinterpreted, it doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to see why. So I don't think Patton's defence here really stands up. But my opinion appears to be wrong, because the War Department's Inspector General's office decided that Patton was not at fault for what he said. However, what's also interesting is that in 1944, the War Department changed the US Field Manual to read, "Liability of offending individual. Individuals and organisations who violate the accepted laws and customs of war may be punished therefore." However, the fact that the acts complained of were done pursuant to order of a superior or government sanction may be taken into consideration in determining culpability, either by way of defence or in mitigation of punishment. The person giving such orders may also be punished. There's quite a difference here. The original said that individuals won't be punished if they were following orders, but the commanders may be punished by the belligerent into whose hands they may fall. That implies that committing such acts won't be punished by the US Armed Forces. Only the commanders would be responsible if they were captured by the enemy. Now, the rules were changed, and the I was only following orders defence wouldn't necessarily work, although it might still be taken into consideration. And the commanders could also be punished. So Compton may not have had a defence in 1944 like he had in 1943. As an aside, it does make me wonder why the rule change was brought about. Was it because of the Moscow Declarations of October 1943, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union and Britain, which said that German soldiers and Nazi Party members who had taken part in atrocities, massacres and executions would be punished? The United Nations War Crimes Commission had also been set up in London in the October of 1943 to collect data and documents on the crimes. There was also the Tehran Conference in November 1943, which moved the three powers towards the idea of a post-war trial. So maybe the rules were being changed in preparation for that, in order to prevent the Nazis claiming that they were just following orders. I'm not sure, but it does seem a little too coincidental. As of November 1944, superior orders were no longer to be deemed a complete defence, although they might be considered in determining the degree of a defendant's culpability and in mitigation of punishment. This provision was incorporated by August 1945 and was applied not only to defendants in the Nuremberg trial of November 1945 to October 1946, but in lesser war crime trials as well. American soldiers accused of atrocities, however, were acquitted on the grounds of superior orders as late as July 1945 in a case involving the murders of German civilians committed several months earlier in Vorder. There was clearly a double standard when it came to punishing enemy personnel compared to Allied personnel. Had the Biscari Massacre of 1943 been judged by standards similar to those applied in the Malmedy Massacre trial, George Patton would have been sentenced to at least to life in prison, if not death. Sergeant Horace West and Captain John Compton would certainly have faced death, and many other officers and men would have been subject to a wide range of punishments for having played various roles in the conspiracy or common design to murder Axis POWs. And this historian wasn't the only one to say this. In Hitler's Last General, two British historians argued that if the legal principles used to convict SS troops for the massacre of American POWs at Malmedy had been applied to the Biscari killings, then Patton would have been sentenced to life imprisonment and Bradley to 10 years. As for Colonel Cookson, who had commanded the 180th Infantry Regiment, he would have been sentenced to death. Whether one agrees with this assessment or not, it is arguable that, in light of the principle of command responsibility for war crimes, some culpability may well have attached to senior American commanders in Sicily. Anyway, Captain Compton went back to work and was killed in combat on the 8th of November 1943. Sergeant West, though, was kept in a prison in North Africa under US Army control. By not shipping him back to the United States, they mitigated any chance of his crimes being discovered by the Germans and Italians or by the domestic press. Interestingly though, Eisenhower decided to give West another chance, and when West's brother wrote to the army and a member of Congress about the case, the government realised that they couldn't keep the thing quiet for too long. So in November 1944, Sergeant West was restored to active duty. The Biscari incidents in the cases of Sergeant West and Captain Compton weren't made public until the 1950s, well after the war was over. And Borch also says that there are a few lessons we may learn from the Biscari incidents. One might conclude that an officer serving in 1943 could expect different treatment at a court-martial from an enlisted soldier being prosecuted for a similar offence. Another lesson might be that culpability for war crimes very much depends on who wins the war, so-called victor's justice. But perhaps the most important lesson is that commanders must be careful when giving a speech designed to instill aggressiveness and a warrior spirit in their subordinates. Word choice does matter, and soldiers do listen to what commanders say to them. So that is the history behind the Biscari incidents. Now we turn to the slapping incidents. I want to be as fair as possible to Patton and confirm that at the time of the slapping incidents, Patton himself was suffering from battle fatigue, or just fatigue in general. And actually the first person he slapped later stated that he believed this to be the case, so that's worth bearing in mind as we move on. But it wasn't unusual for Patton to visit the wounded. He did this quite often, more than most other commanders, believing that his presence would improve morale and would give him a chance to see the battlefield up close. For example, on the 2nd of August 1943, he had visited a hospital and pinned 40 Purple Hearts on the men hurt in an air raid. Well, on the 3rd of August 1943, Patton visited one hospital near Nicosia, where he came across a private who didn't appear to be wounded. This was Private Charles Cool from L Company of the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division. According to the senior medical officer, this is what happened next. Patton came to Private Cool and asked him what was the matter. The soldier replied, "I guess I can't take it." The general immediately flared up, cursed the soldier, called him all types of coward, then slapped him across the face with his gloves, and finally grabbed the soldier by the scruff of his neck and kicked him out of the tent. Patton told the doctors not to admit this son of a female dog and to send him back to his unit. He said he didn't want yellow-bellied, fatherless children stinking up the place of honour. "You hear me, you gutless bee? You're going back to the front." Witnesses were appalled by what they saw. Patton, though, didn't calm down and wrote in his diary, "In the hospital, I also met the only arrant coward I have ever seen in this army. This man was sitting, trying to look as if he had been wounded. I asked him what was the matter, and he said he just couldn't take it. I gave him the devil, slapped his face with my gloves, and kicked him out of the hospital. Companies should deal with such men, and if they shirk their duty, they should be tried for cowardice and shot." It was discovered the same day, but after the slapping, that Private Cool wasn't just a coward, but was actually sick. He had a temperature of 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit and had had chronic diarrhea for a month. Plus, the day after he had been slapped, he was confirmed to be infected with malarial parasites. Now, Patton obviously didn't know any of this when he slapped him, but the point is that Cool's sickness is probably the cause for his battle fatigue, rather than him just being a coward. Patton, though, doesn't seem to have been informed, and 2 days later issued a directive to the 7th Army saying, "It has come to my attention that a very small number of soldiers are going to the hospital on the pretext that they are nervously incapable of combat. Such men are cowards and bring discredit on the army and disgrace to their comrades, whom they heartlessly leave to endure the dangers of battle while they, themselves, use the hospital as a means of escape. You will take measures to see that such cases are not sent to the hospital but are dealt with in their units. Those who are not willing to fight will be tried by court-martial for cowardice in the face of the enemy." Then, on the 10th of August, Patton visited another hospital, where he came across Private Paul Bennett from C Battery of the 17th Field Artillery. Patton asked Bennett what the problem was. Again, the senior medical officer described what happened. "It's my nerves," said Bennett, and he began to sob. The general then screamed at him. "What did you say?" The man replied, "It's my nerves. I can't stand the shelling anymore." He was still sobbing. The general then yelled at him, "Your nerves? Hell, you are just a goddamn coward, you yellow son of a female dog." He then slapped the man and said, "Shut up that goddamn crying. I won't have these brave men here who have been shot at seeing a yellow William the Conqueror sitting here crying." He then struck the man again, knocking his helmet liner off and into the next tent. He then turned to the emitting officer and yelled, "Don't admit this yellow illegitimate. There's nothing the matter with him. I won't have the hospitals cluttered up with these sons of female dogs who haven't got the guts to fight." He then turned to the man again, who was managing to sit at attention, though shaking all over, and said, You're going back to the front lines, and you may get shot and killed, but you're going to fight. If you don't, I'll stand you up against a wall and have a firing squad kill you on purpose. In fact, he said, reaching for his pistol, I ought to shoot you myself, you goddamn whimpering coward. As he left the tent, the general was still yelling back to the receiving officer to send that yellow son of a dog back to the front line. Nurses and patients attracted by the shouting and cursing came from adjoining tents and witnessed this disturbance. Alternate accounts say that Patton was shaking with anger. Some say he took out his pistol and waved it at Bennett's face, then slapped him with the flat of his hand. A nurse may have tried to move towards Patton to stop him, but was restrained by a doctor. Patton also seems to have walked away before coming back to slap the man again. The hospital commander, Colonel Courier, had to place himself between Patton and Bennett to stop the assault from continuing. Patton then moved on to the other tents, but was close to tears and kept talking about Bennett. At this point he said things like, I can't help it, but it makes my blood boil to think of a yellow taxman being babied. And he told the hospital commander, Colonel Courier, I meant what I said about getting that coward out of here. I won't have those cowardly benefit scroungers hanging around our hospitals. We'll probably have to shoot them sometime anyway, or we'll raise a breed of morons. A reporter from the Daily Mail also heard Patton say to the hospital commander, There's no such thing as shell shock, it's an invention of the Jews. And that evening wrote in his diary, At another evacuation hospital saw another alleged nervous patient, really a coward. I told the doctor to return him to his company and he began to cry, so I cursed him well and he shut up. I may have saved his soul, if he had one. Again, Patton hadn't seen the whole story. Bennett had been in the army for 4 years, enlisting before Pearl Harbor, and had had no problems up until the 6th of August. His friend had been wounded, and Bennett couldn't sleep because of this, and was nervous about the shelling. The next day he became even more nervous about the friend, and was sent to the rear. He was given some medicine to help him sleep, but his nervousness remained, and after another day the medical officer ordered him to be evacuated. Bennett begged to stay with his unit, but was forced to the rear, which is when he ended up in the hospital that Patton visited. Again, he was sick, had a fever, was clearly fatigued, and wasn't allowed by the medical staff to return to the front. So again, Patton had misjudged the patient. I've no medical background, so I don't want to speculate whether other illnesses cause or are a significant contributing factor causing a soldier to get battle fatigue or shell shock. But in these two cases, that seems to be what had happened. And the fact that the second guy wanted to stay at the front shows that this probably wasn't cowardice. At the very least, both of these soldiers were sick, and so shouldn't have been at the front anyway. So no matter which way you look at it, Patton was wrong for thinking these guys were cowards and shouldn't have been in the hospital. And clearly, slapping soldiers and saying that they should be shot and offering to shoot them himself is not how a respectable general should behave. This is why Eisenhower wrote to Patton and said, If there is a very considerable element of truth in the allegations accompanying this letter, I must so seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline as to raise serious doubts in my mind as to your future usefulness. Even if these men had been genuine cowards, a general shouldn't have been slapping them. A formal investigation and formal charges should have been the action taken, not assault, and Patton himself admitted later that slapping them wasn't the right course of action. After slapping Bennett, Patton went to 2nd Corps Command Post to see Bradley. Sorry to be late, Bradley. I stopped off at a hospital on the way up. There were a couple of malingerers there. I slapped one of them to make him mad and put some fight back in him. Bradley later reported, he was bragging how he had treated this man to snap him out of being a coward. Thought that if he made the man mad, he could be mad enough to fight. That men were showing a yellow streak. He didn't agree with me that every man has a breaking point. Some are low, some are high. We call the low points cowards. To George, anyone who didn't want to fight was a coward. He honestly thought he was putting fighting into these men. He was pleased with what he had done. He was bragging about the incident. Bradley didn't report the incident to Eisenhower because doing so would be jumping rank, but the medical staff didn't care. They sent a report directly to Eisenhower. Worse, rumours quickly spread about what had happened, and the press got wind of it as well. They also approached Eisenhower demanding action, with one saying, "There are at least 50,000 American soldiers who would shoot Patton if they had the slightest chance." Eisenhower, though, told the reporters to bury the story because it would be bad for the war effort if they lost Patton. They agreed to it, and after a few sleepless nights, Eisenhower decided not to bring official charges against Patton. He did, though, write a scathing letter to Patton. Eisenhower advised Patton to apologise to the individuals involved, although it was on the advice of someone else that Patton decided to extend that apology to each division in the 7th Army. But either way, he spoke to the doctors and the nurses and Cool and Bennett in person. He even addressed the incident to the rest of the army. The 1st Division, which was the division both Cool and Bennett came from, sat in absolute silence as Patton made his speech. They had been told that booing wasn't permitted, and that they couldn't take their firearms in either. None of them were impressed, and some booing did take place. "We despise him," one artillery sergeant said. The biggest issue, though, is that Patton doesn't seem to have thought that he was wrong. He believed he was just appeasing his superiors. "I had Private Paul G. Bennett in and explained to him that I had cussed him out in the hope of restoring his manhood, that I was sorry, and that if he cared, I would like to shake hands with him. We shook. General John A. Crane, to whose brigade he belongs, stated to me afterwards that the man was absent without leave and had gone to the rear by falsely representing his condition to the battery surgeon. It is rather a commentary on justice when an army commander has to soft-soap a skulker to placate the timidity of those above." The brigade commander was wrong. Bennett hadn't been AWOL and hadn't falsely represented his condition. But Crane had reinforced Patton's belief that he had been right. This is perhaps why Patton's apology to the doctors and nurses didn't sound much like an apology. Colonel Currier, the head doctor at Bennett's hospital, said that it wasn't really an apology at all, but more of an attempt to justify what he had done. The same can be said about what he wrote back to Eisenhower. It was an explanation about why he had done what he did, not an apology. He even wrote in his diary on the 20th of November that he was right in what he did. And interestingly, a lot of the soldiers he spoke to about this didn't really care. They knew he was in the wrong, but didn't think it was worth worrying about. It was only the medical personnel who were concerned because they believed battle fatigue was a genuine illness. When he addressed the 3rd Division, the men sensed he was about to apologise, and so began chanting, "No, General, no, no," and wouldn't let him speak. Patton was choked up and had tears in his eyes. He left abruptly and drove away. The 60th Regiment of the 9th Division chanted "Georgie, Georgie," and didn't let him speak at all. While another regiment of the same division caused Patton to stop talking, turned red, and then leave. How? Because some of the men in the rear had blown up condom balloons and let them float above the crowd in the breeze. Clearly, they didn't care. Even Eisenhower admitted to the press that the men thought that no harm had been done, and that when Patton appeared to speak to a crowd of his own soldiers, he was always greeted by thunderous applause. I mention this because there are different perspectives on this. Some people would probably argue that slapping 2 soldiers who may or may not have been sick and or cowards isn't that big a deal, especially when compared to being in combat or some of the bigger crimes going on at the time. Certainly when viewed against the Biscari incidents where a lot of people died, slapping 2 soldiers seems trivial. Okay, maybe Patton was in the wrong and his temper certainly needed to be checked, but it could be argued that his entire career shouldn't have been on the line over this, nor should we judge his entire character just by these infamous instances. Did people at the time share his views? Yes, it seems so. The soldiers and some other generals certainly did. So maybe it could be argued that Patton was a man of his time. The enormous publicity over the slappings ensured that the Germans also learned of Patton's problems. There was genuine perplexity over what the fuss was all about. In the German army, it was not unusual for a soldier accused of malingering or cowardice to be summarily shot without recourse or trial. Why, they wondered, when success in battle was more important than personal development, would the Americans even consider jeopardizing their own effort by punishing their most thrustful leader? General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief of the OKW Army High Command, thought the publicity about Patton nothing more than Allied propaganda to lull the Germans into believing Patton was to have no further role against them. On the other hand, though, it could be argued that a man with such responsibility should be able to contain his temper. The medical staff, Eisenhower, and, as we're about to hear, the press and the general public thought this was a big deal. Many generals and officials thought that Patton should be sacked over this, including General Marshall, and, as I mentioned before, a general shouldn't be slapping soldiers, even if they were cowards, right? A formal investigation and formal charges should have been brought against them, not assault. And what we have to also remember is that one of these soldiers was a conscript. He had been forced to fight in this military, and not necessarily willingly either. Is it cowardly to be forced against your will to fight in an army, and then be battle fatigued as a result of the combat you were forced to partake in, and then do you deserve to be slapped across the face by your general and called a coward? Even if these guys had been genuine cowards, they arguably didn't deserve this treatment. And even for men who had signed up voluntarily, they had no idea what they were signing up for. War was often painted as a glorious thing, like a playground brawl. But it's nothing like that. These men, and even people today, are signing up to something that they have no idea about. And they get out into the field and discover the harsh and unforgiving reality. It's no game, right? War is probably humanity at its worst. A nightmarish hell that can break the best of men. And when it does break them, they then get slapped by their general for being cowards. Right? They don't deserve that. Patton had brought shame on himself and on the army he cherished, and for decades his name could hardly be uttered without conjuring not only his battlefield panache, but also his reprehensible behaviour, unworthy of an American. Now, it wasn't until late November 1943 that the slapping incidents were leaked and made public. When they did, Patton wrote in his diary, "I had been expecting something like this to happen for some time because I am sure that it would have been much better to have admitted the whole thing to start with, particularly in view of the fact that I was right in what I did." And just to clarify, the words in the brackets were added by Blumenson, not myself. So Patton was saying that he thought he was right to slap these soldiers. Patton was painted in the press as the type of villain the Allies were supposedly fighting against. He was compared to Hitler. And Eisenhower was also criticised for letting Patton get away with his behaviour. Officials now demanded Patton's dismissal. Thanksgiving Day. I had nothing to be thankful for, so I did not give thanks. One friend wrote to Patton to say, "Such cowards used to be shot, but now they are encouraged. Only those who carry the responsibility of winning battles know the difficulty of making men fight, and so far you have excelled all others in this accomplishment." Regardless of the crime committed, Eisenhower did the right thing and didn't bow to public pressure. Whether Patton deserved to be dismissed or not, that decision shouldn't be made solely on the basis of public outrage. And Eisenhower had clearly already decided not to dismiss Patton prior to this point, so he stood firm in his conviction that Patton was a good field commander. Patton, meanwhile, remained firm in his convictions throughout this time. "I love and admire good soldiers and brave men. I hate and despise slackers and cowards. I inspected some 300 freshly wounded men who had gallantly and unflinchingly done their duty, and who, in spite of their wounds, were cheerful and uncomplaining. The last man I came to was a forlorn individual sitting on a box, apparently waiting to have a wound dressed. I asked him where he had been hit. He replied that he had not been hit, but that he just could not take it, and had come to the hospital to avoid combat. The contrast between this cur, who was not only skulking himself, but, by his cowardice, was forcing other loyal and brave men to do his duty, and the heroes I had just been talking to so moved me that I slapped him across the face with the gloves I was carrying in my hand, shook him and called him a coward, and told him to get back to his outfit and try to be a man. He explained the second incident, which he admits was practically identical, and then says, "There is no doubt that my method was too forthright. They will not be repeated." Patton also lost a long-time friend. One of the saddest aspects of the slapping incidents was the dissolution of the long friendship between Patton and General John J. Pershing, who privately became one of Patton's sternest critics. Although Patton wrote several letters to Pershing during the remainder of the war, the old general never replied. The outrage continued for a couple of months, but supporters of Patton also started to fire back, with some even calling for his promotion. And the rage subsided when it was realised that the priority was to win the war, something Patton had the capability of doing. The point was, keeping Patton in command of his army was a public relations error, but militarily sound. Eisenhower could not dispense with this battle-tested army commander. Dismissing Patton would only give aid and comfort to the enemy. Private Cool, recovered from his illness and cowardice, returned to his unit and later landed in Normandy in 1944. Private Bennett also returned to duty, suggesting that neither of them were really cowards. So that is the history of the slapping incidents. Now, going back to the original question, the traditional explanation is that the slapping incidents were the reason Patton was relieved of command. But, as Robert asked, could the Biscari incidents have contributed to this decision? And if so, by how much? Well, the problem with the idea that the Biscari incidents contributed to Patton's loss of command is that the trials of West and Compton didn't happen until after Eisenhower had reacted to the slapping incidents. Sergeant West was the first to be tried, and his court-martial didn't begin until the 2nd of September 1943, and Compton's trial didn't begin until late October 1943. By this point, Patton was overseeing the reduction of the US 7th Army and had been passed over for command of any armies taking part in the Italian Campaign and for command of American forces taking part in the invasion of Normandy, which went to Bradley. Now, yes, it wasn't until November 1943 that everything kicked off in the press, and Patton did believe that it was the slapping incidents that were the reason he was passed over for command of US forces in the invasion of Normandy. But that doesn't make it so. The slapping incidents must certainly have reaffirmed in Eisenhower's mind that Bradley, not Patton, was the better choice for the job, but that decision had been made months before the incident became public knowledge. Eisenhower had judged Patton's combat abilities to be too volatile and unstable for the initial landings, believing that Bradley was the safer choice. But he still thought that Patton was the best choice to lead the troops once the breakout from Normandy was on the cards, when an aggressive drive was needed. Thus, it is a myth that slapping 2 GIs cost Patton leadership of Overlord. The truth is that Eisenhower would never have chosen him for the job, but it was also true that, after the Sicily operation, Patton was put on the shelf. The slapping incidents, and maybe the Biscari incidents too, led to the extension of the gap between commands, which ended up being 11 months. But by themselves probably didn't bring about his relief from command. Patton's command style wasn't always needed and could be detrimental in certain circumstances. Eisenhower also had genuine concerns about Patton's abilities, even if he had admitted that he was a hard-driving general. He thought he was a selfish general who would throw his men under the bus if it got him greater fame. Bradley also said this about Patton: "I would have relieved him instantly and would have had nothing more to do with him. He was colourful, but he was impetuous, full of temper, bluster, inclined to treat the troops and subordinates as morons. His whole concept of command was opposite to mine. He was primarily a showman. The show always seemed to come first." So I don't think the Biscari and slapping incidents led to Patton not having a command for several months. But they do raise a lot of questions about Patton and about the Allies in general. Was Patton fit for duty? Were the Western Allies and generals playing by one set of rules and punishing Axis forces under another? How should we treat prisoners of war? And is there a difference between cowardice and battle fatigue? Should we punish soldiers who snap under some of the harshest circumstances human beings can go through? Is it right to punish people for obeying orders or laws that are wrong? And should the tribe be able to force an individual to go to war? These are tough questions. I know what I'd say, but I'm curious to hear what you think. Let me know below. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.